the house on Griggs Street had been paid off in 1998. Arthur Simmons knew the exact date because he had written it on a slip of paper and tucked it into the frame of a photograph on the mantel. A picture of himself in his 20s, standing beside a Dodge Charger on an assembly line at the Chrysler Jefferson Avenue plant. Joe, 1 year old in that photograph, and he had the kind of smile that comes from believing the future is already negotiated. For 30 years, Arthur had shown up. He worked the line, he paid into his pension, and he trusted a simple, iron-bound promise that the city of Detroit would honor its commitment to him. When his body finally said enough, his pension was called a defined benefit plan, a contract written in the language of mathematics, not a suggestion, not a forecast, a defined benefit, a number agreed upon, locked in. Retired in 2007 with a monthly check of $1,840. It wasn't wealth. It was survival with dignity, which is something different and rarer. He had a garden in the backyard, a granddaughter who visited on Sundays, and a routine that suited a man who had spent 30 years inside the organized chaos of a manufacturing floor. He was not rich, he was fine. And fine, for Arthur, was everything. Then came July 18th, 2013. That was the morning Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, and Arthur Simmons discovered, along with 32,000 other retirees, that the word defined is only as strong as the institution behind it. To understand what happened to Arthur, you have to understand what happened to Detroit, not in a single catastrophic moment, but over the course of 50 years of slow-motion collapse, so gradual that by the time anyone acknowledged the emergency, the patient was already in organ failure. In the 1950s, Detroit was the fourth largest city in the United States. It was the engine of the American century, a place where a man with a strong back and a willingness to show up could buy a house, raise a family, and retire with a pension. The city had money because the industry had money. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, they paid taxes, they employed workers who paid taxes, and the tax base funded schools, parks, and the city government that ran elaborate systems of civil service. Then the industry began to leave. Slowly at first, a plant closure here, a suburban relocation there, and then all at once, as foreign competition, automation, and corporate migration hollowed out the manufacturing core that had given Detroit its identity and its tax revenue. Between 1950 and 2013, Detroit's population fell from 1.8 million to fewer than 700,000. The people who stayed were, on average, poorer than the people who left. The property tax base shrank. The income tax base shrank. But the obligations, the debts, the pensions, the bond payments did not shrink with them. By the time the bankruptcy filing hit the courthouse, Detroit carried approximately $18 billion in long-term debt and unfunded liabilities. That figure demands to be held in the mind for a moment. $18 billion, it was not a rounding error. It was not the product of a single bad decision or single corrupt official. It was the accumulated weight of a city trying to maintain 21st century services on a 20th century economic foundation, year after year plugging the gaps with borrowing and deferral and creative accounting until the creative accounting ran out of room. A significant portion of that debt came from something called pension obligation certificates, a financial instrument that sounds like a technical detail but is, at its heart, a confession. The city had borrowed money from Wall Street banks at market interest rates to fund its pension obligations. In other words, Detroit took out high-interest loans to pay for promises it had already made. It was not investing in its future. It was mortgaging its future to pay for its past. The city had been doing this for years. Each year's budget was a kind of controlled hallucination Numbers that looked balanced on paper because the underlying structural crisis had been deferred, kicked forward to the next administration, the next council, the next crisis. But the pension obligation certificates were only the visible rod. Beneath them, discovered piece by piece as investigators began to pull apart Detroit's financial records, was something more insidious. In the mid-2000s, seeking to manage the ballooning costs of those borrowings, city officials had entered into complex financial arrangements with global investment banks. These arrangements were called interest rate swaps. In theory, a swap is a risk management tool, a kind of financial insurance policy that allows a borrower to stabilize their exposure to fluctuating interest rates. A city pays a fixed rate to a bank. The bank pays a floating rate back. When rates are stable, the arrangement is neutral. When rates fall sharply, as they did during and after the 2008 financial crisis, the arrangement becomes catastrophically one-sided. Detroit's swaps, entered into with Bank of America and UBS, were not designed with Detroit's interests at the center. They were designed with the complexity and opacity typical of instruments sold to municipalities by financial advisors who were simultaneously collecting fees from the banks structuring the deals. When the Federal Reserve cut interest rates to near zero in response to the 2008 collapse, Detroit found itself locked into paying fixed rates on debt, while the floating rate payments coming back to the city dropped toward nothing. Worse still, the swaps contained what are known as termination clauses, provisions that allowed the banks to demand full repayment of their position if Detroit's credit rating dropped below a certain threshold. As the city's financial situation deteriorated and the rating agencies downgraded its debt, those clauses activated. The banks came knocking for termination fees estimated at more than $350 million. This was the vampire in the vault. While pension funds were already underfunded, the city had for years been skipping or reducing its required annual contributions, a practice so common in American municipal finance that it barely registered as scandal. The swap payments and termination fees were draining what remained. Every dollar siphoned toward the banks was a dollar not sitting in Arthur Simmons' pension fund. The people who had negotiated these arrangements were, in many cases, no longer in office. Some had moved to the private sector, some had died. The contracts they had signed remained, binding the city to obligations its residents had never voted for, and in most cases never knew existed. This is the central crime of the Detroit story. Not crime in the technical, prosecutorial sense, though there were certainly instances of corruption and self-dealing within the city government during this period. The deeper crime was structural, the systematic transfer of public wealth collected from working people in the form of taxes and pension contributions into the hands of financial institutions through instruments so complex that the elected officials approving them often did not fully understand what they were signing. The information asymmetry was staggering. The banks had teams of quantitative analysts. Detroit had a city treasurer. On December 3, 2013, federal bankruptcy judge Stephen Rhodes sat in a Detroit courtroom and delivered a ruling that would rewrite American municipal law. Then, de super cruel, the state of Michigan's constitution was unambiguous on the subject of public pensions. Article 9, Section 24 stated that accrued financial benefits of public pension plans constitute a contractual obligation that shall not be diminished or impaired. The word shall in constitutional law is not casual. It is an absolute. The Michigan Constitution was telling its citizens in the plainest possible language that their pensions were protected. Sacrosanct. Untouchable. Attorneys representing Detroit's retirees stood before Judge Rhodes and made what seemed to any layperson an airtight argument. The state constitution protects these pensions. The city cannot cut them. End of discussion. Judge Rhodes was sympathetic but unmoved. His ruling that day was technically precise, and to the retirees, devastating. Federal bankruptcy law, he held, supersedes state constitutional protections. The Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, the provision establishing that federal law takes precedence over state law when they conflict, meant that once Detroit had entered federal bankruptcy proceedings, the protections of the Michigan Constitution no longer applied with the same force. The pensions, Judge Rhodes ruled, were unsecured debt. That phrase, unsecured debt, is the mechanism of the disaster. In bankruptcy law, creditors are arranged in a hierarchy. Secured creditors, those holding claims backed by specific collateral, stand at the front of the line. Unsecured creditors stand at the back. Among unsecured creditors, all claims are, in principle, equal. Detroit's retirees were now in the same legal category as a hardware store waiting on an unpaid invoice. The ruling sent a shockwave through every state in the Union. If Michigan's ironclad constitutional guarantee could be overridden in federal bankruptcy court, then no state's promise was truly safe. Public workers in Illinois, California, New Jersey, states with their own constitutional pension protections and their own looming pension crises, suddenly had reason to question whether those protections would hold if the worst happened. What Judge Rhodes had done with careful legal precision was reveal that the safety of a pension depends not only on the legal protections surrounding it, but on the solvency of the institution behind it. A guarantee is only as strong as the guarantor. Detroit had made promises it could not keep. A law confronted with that reality chose the machinery of insolvency over the poetry of commitment. Arthur Simmons, sitting at his kitchen table in Griggs Street, learned about the ruling from the evening news. Ardent about the ruling from the evening news. Psst, he called his daughter, who was a nurse. She asked him what it meant. He said he wasn't sure yet. He was right to be uncertain. As the bankruptcy proceedings ground forward through 2013 and into 2014, a battle emerged that captured something essential about the values of American public life. The Detroit Institute of Arts was, by any measure, one of the great art museums of the world. Its collection included works of extraordinary value. Diego Rivera murals commissioned during the New Deal, European masterpieces acquired in the early 20th century, when Detroit's industrial wealth was at its height. Diego Rivera murals commissioned during the New Deal, European masterpieces acquired in the early 20th century when Detroit's during the New Deal. European masterpieces acquired in the early 20th century when Detroit's during the New Deal. European masterpiece, a trove of American art that documented the country's history with unusual depth and intelligence. The collection had been assembled over more than a century. It was, in the fullest sense, a civic treasure, owned not by a private foundation or a wealthy individual, but by the city of Detroit, and, by extension, by its people. Detroit's creditors, the banks and bondholders, owed money through the bankruptcy, looked at those paintings and saw something different. They saw assets. They argued, with the cold logic of insolvency law, that the city's obligation to its creditors required it to liquidate whatever value it possessed. If that meant selling Van Goghs and Rembrandts at auction, so be it. That was what the law required of a debtor acting in good faith. The prospect was grotesque to many observers, but it was not legally absurd. Museums throughout history have deaccessioned works to cover financial shortfalls. The question of whether a bankrupt city should be compelled to liquidate cultural assets to pay financial debts was genuinely novel and genuinely contested. What emerged instead was one of the most unusual financial arrangements in American legal history, known as the Grand Bargain. A coalition of private foundations, including the Ford Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and the Knight Foundation, along with the state of Michigan, agreed to contribute approximately $816 million to a specially created trust. This trust would be used for two purposes. It would fund a buyout of the Detroit Institute of Arts collection, transferring ownership from the city to an independent nonprofit and thus removing the artwork from the bankruptcy estate, and a significant portion of the money would flow directly into the pension fund, used to reduce the cuts that retirees would otherwise face. The grand bargain was celebrated in the press as a creative and humane solution. It was also examined clearly, an acknowledgement of profound institutional failure. Private philanthropies had been required to fill a gap that public institutions, the city, the state, the financial system had created through decades of mismanagement, underfunding, and predatory deal-making. The foundations were not villains. They were doing something generous and necessary. But the necessity itself was an indictment. For the retirees, the grand bargain was relief filtered through loss. The pension cuts, which had initially been projected at levels that would have been catastrophic, some estimates suggested reductions of up to 30%, were moderated by the infusion of grand bargain funds. The final deal, approved in late 2014, cut pensions by approximately 4.5% and eliminated annual cost of living adjustments, the increases that had allowed fixed pension payments to track inflation entirely and permanently. For Arthur Simmons, the monthly check dropped from $1,840 to approximately $1,757. The cost of living adjustment he had counted on, the mechanism that would have allowed his pension to hold its value as prices rose, was gone. His pension was now a fixed number in a world where prices are not fixed. Every year, imperceptibly, its purchasing power would erode. The math of it was slow and relentless, like rust. The bankruptcy was officially resolved in December 2014, approximately 17 months after it was filed. Detroit emerged from Chapter 9 with reduced debt, a restructured financial architecture, and a new state oversight board charged with monitoring its finances going forward. The city's emergency manager, Kevin Orr, declared the process a success. By many technical measures it was. The banks that had sold Detroit its interest rate swaps received a settlement as part of the proceedings. They recovered a substantial portion of what they were owed. They had lawyers who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. They had, from the moment the swaps were structured, anticipated the range of possible outcomes and positioned themselves accordingly. The retirees had not. In the years following the bankruptcy, Detroit has shown genuine signs of revival. Downtown redevelopment, a growing technology and creative sector, an influx of younger residents drawn by low real estate costs and civic energy. The city has changed in ways that would have been difficult to predict at the nadir of the bankruptcy. Some of this change is authentic. Some of it has raised legitimate concerns about displacement and who benefits from the new Detroit versus who suffered through the collapse of the old one. Arthur Simmons, now in his 70s, lives in a neighborhood that has not experienced the downtown renaissance. His story is not unusual among his generation. What the Detroit case left behind, beyond the physical reality of the city and its residents, was a legal and policy legacy that continues to shape American municipal finance. The precedent established by Judge Rhodes's ruling has never been overturned. It remains the law. In a federal bankruptcy proceeding, state constitutional protections for public pensions can be overridden. This creates what legal scholars call a gap in the safety net, a space where workers who have done everything right, who have paid into their systems and played by the rules, can find themselves legally reclassified as unsecured creditors in their old age. The Detroit case also exposed the extent to which public pension systems operate without meaningful transparency. The complexity of the swap arrangements, the practice of skipping annual pension contributions, the use of pension obligation certificates to mask structural deficits, none of this was secret in a technical sense. The documents existed. The contracts were filed, but they were not written to be understood by the people most affected by them. They were written in the language of a financial system that profits in part from the gap between what it knows and what its counterparties know. This is the lesson that Detroit tried, at enormous human cost, to teach. A defined benefit is a legal claim, not a physical fact. It exists in documents, in relationships, in the solvency and good faith of institutions. When those institutions fail, through mismanagement, through economic catastrophe, through the predatory exploitation of complexity by sophisticated actors at the expense of unsophisticated ones, the legal claim can be renegotiated. The word defined can be renegotiated. The word defined can be redefined. True retirement security, the Detroit case suggests, requires more than a promise. It requires transparency, the kind that allows workers and citizens to see year by year exactly how well funded their pensions are, exactly what financial instruments their cities have entered into on their behalf, exactly what risks are being managed and what risks are being ignored. It requires accountability, mechanisms that allow ordinary people to understand and contest financial decisions made in their name before those decisions become crises. And it requires the political will to make hard choices in good years, rather than catastrophic choices in bad ones. None of those requirements are simple. All of them are possible. Arthur Simmons still tends his garden on Gogh Street. The photograph on the mantel has yellowed slightly at the edges. The slip of paper noting his paid-off mortgage is still there, tucked into the frame. He does not talk about the bankruptcy much. He says there is not much to say about a thing that was done to him rather than by him. He gets his check on the 3rd of every month. It is $1,757. It does not increase. Whoa. He would like his granddaughter to understand what happened. He's not sure he has the words for it. He's not sure the words exist in the language that ordinary people use for ordinary things. The words that describe what happened to his pension, swaps, termination clauses, unsecured debt, Chapter 9, the Supremacy Clause, belong to a different language. A language designed, perhaps not entirely by accident, to make what was done to him difficult to see clearly. That is the final lesson of Detroit. The most powerful financial crimes do not require a mask or a gun. They require a contract, a legal framework, and the patient confidence that the people most harmed will never fully understand what happened to them. Arthur understands enough. He just wishes the rest of America did too. If you were Arthur and your pension was cut after 30 years of service, what would you do? Fight in court? Accept it? Or something else entirely? Answers in the comments section.